Malcolm Carter. Routine drive home turned into a nightmare when two officers unjustly stopped and humiliated him. Just as tensions escalated, Captain Daniel Whitmore arrived, revealing Malcolm as the next police chief. The corrupt officers were fired, and Malcolm used the incident to push for major reforms. His leadership transformed the police force, proving that justice and change are possible with courage and determination. Malcolm Carter didn't expect to be pulled over that night for no reason, but the officer's humiliation only fueled his resolve. Captain Daniel Whitmore arrived just in time, changing everything. Malcolm's next move shocked everyone, even the seasoned. But let's go back to the start. It was late evening, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. Malcolm Carter was driving home on a deserted road, dimly lit by streetlights. Soft jazz played, adding a sense of calm. He was tired, but satisfied with a productive day. Suddenly, a siren's wail broke the silence. Red and blue lights flashed as a police car stopped behind him. Malcolm felt a wave of anxiety, though he'd followed all laws. He pulled over, stopping as required. The patrol car braked sharply, and two officers approached. Garrett, a tall officer with a stern face, demanded his license, while Ethan stood behind, hand near his gun. Malcolm handed over his papers calmly, sensing Garrett's contempt. "Where have you been? Why so late?" Garrett's tone was sarcastic, as if Malcolm was already guilty. Malcolm explained he was returning from work, but the officer's distrust grew. Ethan began questioning minor details. "Why are your rear lights dirty?" Malcolm's answers were steady, but his nerves frayed. Garrett suddenly opened the door, ordering Malcolm out. Knowing resistance was futile, he complied. They surrounded him, searched roughly, with Garrett making sarcastic comments. Malcolm remained calm despite the humiliation, fingers wide from tension. The search yielded nothing, but the officers seemed determined not to let him off easily. Malcolm knew this was just the start of a long battle for justice. Malcolm stood by the hood of his car, trying to remain calm. The cold night air heightened his sense of helplessness. The officers, unable to find anything suspicious during the search, appeared frustrated and angry. Garrett stepped back, scrutinizing Malcolm as if considering how to humiliate him further. His eyes swept over Malcolm's clothes, and finding no grounds for arrest, he decided to take a different approach. "You're acting way too cocky for someone on the brink of being arrested," Garrett began, his voice loud and arrogant, attracting the attention of passers-by who were slowly gathering along the roadside. "Look at you, all dressed up like you're the king here, not a suspect. Your tone, Carter, isn't exactly fitting for the situation," Ethan added, his voice uncertain but emboldened by his partner's forcefulness. Malcolm, understanding that the conversation was rapidly turning into a personal attack, looked up but remained silent, fully aware that every word could be used against him. Anger flared inside him, but he pushed it down, recalling the caution his family had always instilled in him. Meanwhile, Garrett crossed a line, making unambiguous racist remarks. "Are you sure this is your car? Guys like you don't usually afford rides like this. Or did you steal it?" He sneered, hoping to provoke a reaction. Ethan, realizing Garrett was going too far, lowered his gaze momentarily, as if sensing the situation was spiraling out of control. But he stayed put, supporting his partner's authority. He merely nodded silently at each new insult, clearly unwilling to intervene. Malcolm, feeling his humiliation shift to a cold calm, suddenly decided to tell the truth. "You better stop before this goes too far," he said evenly. But Garrett ignored his words, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "You don't have the right to say anything here. People like you never change," he spat out with open hatred. Malcolm knew every step was being recorded on the hidden camera he kept in his car, a small but important precaution he always took after previous encounters with the police. He remained silent, a faint smile appearing on his face, barely noticeable, but it was enough to push Garrett over the edge. "Are you laughing at me?" the officer shouted, stepping forward and shoving Malcolm in the chest. "Think this is all a joke?" "I'm not laughing," Malcolm replied calmly, his gaze firm and confident, the slight smile only emphasizing his composure. This infuriated Garrett even more. Ethan, still wavering, briefly touched his partner's shoulder, as if trying to stop him. But Garrett shook off his hand and continued his insults, completely unaware that his words and actions were all on camera. Malcolm stood his ground, his calm turning into quiet confidence. He knew it wouldn't be long before these men realized a grave mistake they had made by humiliating him that night. The sound of an approaching car cut through the night just after another of Garrett's spiteful comments. The bright headlights of a police car illuminated Malcolm's face, who stood there, teeth clenched, ready to push back. He was about to move, to finally end this humiliating scene, but then the car door opened and a tall man in uniform stepped out. Daniel Whitmore. His gaze was intense and focused, and the golden captain's badge gleamed on his chest. Garrett and Ethan, confident in their authority, froze, surprised to see Daniel approaching. Garrett, maintaining his usual sarcastic bravado, raised his hand in a casual greeting. "Well, I guess we have a new spectator," he sneered. But his smile vanished when Daniel raised his hand, signaling silence. "What's happening here?" Daniel asked coldly, his voice firm but with a fire of determination in his eyes. Garrett hesitated, losing his former confidence under Richard's piercing stare. We're conducting a check," Garrett stammered, but his words sounded unconvincing even to him. Daniel glanced at Malcolm, who stood calmly despite the tense atmosphere. Malcolm knew he could handle the situation himself, but Daniel's unexpected support was a welcome backup he wouldn't reject. Besides, this moment could be the beginning of major changes. "A check?" Daniel repeated, his voice growing harder. "On what grounds?" Garrett faltered, realizing that the usual excuses wouldn't work. The tension reached a breaking point, like a tightrope ready to snap. Daniel took a step forward, his gaze intense enough to pierce through armor. "I'm Captain Daniel Whitmore," he said firmly, "and soon I'll be handing my position to this man, Malcolm Carter." Silence engulfed the road, leaving only Garrett and Ethan strained breathing. Their expressions changed. Confidence gave way to fear. Garrett paled and Ethan froze, struggling to grasp the reality. Now, Daniel's voice was calm but carried a steely threat. "Show me your badges." With trembling hands, Garrett and Ethan reached for their pockets, realizing their power had vanished in an instant. They were no longer the confident representatives of the law, but frightened men standing before the future chief of police. Malcolm watched them with a stony face, inwardly satisfied with how things were unfolding. He knew he could clean up the department, and this night would mark the beginning of a new era, leaving no room for people like Garrett and Ethan. Malcolm turned to Daniel and nodded slightly, acknowledging his support. He had been ready to fight alone, but at that moment his friend's support was timely and important. After Daniel Richards' unexpected arrival and his support, the tension eased slightly, but didn't disappear. Garrett and Ethan, previously confident in their immunity, now looked like school children caught red-handed. They began to mutter incoherently, trying to justify their actions. Garrett, desperately trying to regain control, spoke first, his voice almost trembling. "Captain Whitmore, it was a misunderstanding. We were just following protocol, not knowing that." But his words were cut off when Daniel raised his hands sharply, demanding silence. His voice was decisive. "Protocol? You really think humiliating a man who can handle the situation himself is protocol? No, your actions were not the defense of the law, but a gross violation." Realizing that excuses would no longer help, Garrett and Ethan fell silent, their heads lowered, their shoulders sagged under the weight of inevitable consequences. Daniel turned to the other officers who had gathered around, his voice firm. "Retrieve the video footage from the dash cam," he ordered, "and document everything that happened here. I want every detail recorded." One of the younger officers with a camera silently nodded and headed to Garrett's patrol car to carry out the order. Realizing that the situation had turned into an official investigation, Garrett and Ethan looked increasingly defeated. They knew their careers were as good as over. Daniel, feeling Malcolm's support, turned back to Garrett and Ethan. "There's no place for people like you in our department. Your actions undermine trust in the law and the community. Hand over your badges. You're fired." These words landed like a final verdict. The officers, realizing arguing was pointless, handed over their badges without a word, and defeated, walked back to their cars. Malcolm stood by Daniel, watching their retreat. He knew this was only the beginning. Now it was time to act. The next day, the local news exploded with headlines about a serious breach of law and a new leader ready to change everything. The video of the incident went viral, sparking outrage and debate on social media. People began gathering for protests, demanding change. Malcolm, aware that this was his chance and backed by Daniel's actions, began drafting reform plans. A few days after the incident, he held a press conference where he outlined the proposals for police reform. His suggestions included mandatory bias training for officers, stricter penalties for abuses of power, and the creation of an open oversight system for police activity. Malcolm, now a police captain, was not just standing at the podium. He was actively involved in implementing every stage of the reforms. His determination and confidence attracted attention, and his actions earned the respect of both colleagues and the public. Under his leadership, the department began to change. New protocols for interacting with citizens were developed. Regular stress management and bias reduction training sessions were held. Malcolm proved that the police could serve the community, not control it. Malcolm Carter's story became a symbol of a new era. He became a hero not only for his city, but for many across the state, showing that change is possible if led by someone who believes in justice and is willing to fight for it. Under his leadership, the department became a model for other regions, proving that justice is not an empty word, but a real goal achievable with courage and determination to overcome any obstacle.